Greetings and welcome to the last of the lectures on the design principles. This is chapter 12, Scale and Proportion. So we're talking about size. Here we have the remaining head of a huge sculpture of Constantine the Great, and the size of this head is 8.5 feet tall. Imagine if you were standing next to it. If your feet were down here, you might be somewhere around here. So the size is the measure of it, 8.5 feet tall. Here's a hint, the scale is massive. In contrast to the massiveness of the head of Constantine the Great, this is a miniature work. So the scale, sneak preview, is miniature or minute. Notice that this work right here, from here to here, is 3 3/8 inches. So it is really, really teeny. What's the point of something like this? This is a rosary bead that when opened has two sculptures inside and text. The point to making it so small is that it requires such intense vision on the part of the viewer that it contributes to the sensation of locking out the rest of the world and concentration just onto the meditative objects, which has to do with elements related to the Mass of St. Gregory in Christianity. On the opposite side of the scale, here we have the Cultural Center in Tijuana, and the artist, Krzysztof Wodiczko, created projections, this massive projection that was mapped onto the side of the giant sphere, which forms the main body of the architecture of the piece. So this art is monumental in scale, and because it is also the projection of a human face, just the face, which is a bit distorted when projected onto this spherical surface, it has the effect of being a massive scale shift, and it really kind of dwarfs the viewer. In this famous installation by genius artist James Turrell, you see that the viewers are actually inside of the work of art. It surrounds them completely. So the scale of the work is, again, monumental because the people cannot experience the work unless they are inside of it. This is the famous work by Michael Heitzer. Levitated Mass is located at LA County Museum of Art in Los Angeles on the Miracle Mile, and ordinarily we'd be going there perhaps. You could actually see it. Well, it is outside. I think you might still be able to experience Levitated Mass if you wanted to make the trip up there. And what is it? Well, exactly what it looks like. It is a 340-ton piece of granite that is suspended over a concrete channel. Michael Heitzer is a land artist, and his work tends to investigate the relationship of humans to the landscape and to natural features. So this is certainly a combination of a natural feature, a huge rock, and it's suspended over a man-made concrete channel, and you're able to walk underneath it, stand underneath it, which is a fairly daunting proposition in earthquake country, because who in their right mind wants to take their little kitty underneath a 340-ton piece of granite? Well, that's the point. In some fashion, you have to confront your own mortality and your own weakness in the face of natural elements that are, well, massive, huge, and can crush you flat. And that's what Heitzer is trying to do, is to get you to understand that you have a relationship with your surroundings, and you need to be cognizant of that. Relative size is a term that you are familiar with already. Simply has to do with the comparison between one object and another object. In this case, it's all about comparing the hippo with the people that stand just beyond the fence in the background. The point being that hippo, big, people, not so big. In this case, relative size is used symbolically. The artist is not suggesting that those are really massive ears of corn, but because of where the corn is placed in the work, which is in the foreground, it creates what's called forced perspective, remember that term. And then we have the farmer who's relegated down to the lower left corner, and his head is only about 1/3 the size of an ear of corn because of how the composition is constructed. Because the corn is right up in the front, it magnifies its value. And notice here, Plants of My Native Place is the title of the piece, meaning the farmer is dependent upon the corn for his livelihood. Hence, symbolically, the corn being large in front is given greater heft and greater importance, which is the point to the work. So we've already alluded to scale. Scale is different than size. Size, of course, is a measurement. The scale is a comparison, and it requires size. We need to know the size so that we can compare an object against another object. In particular, humans, remember, egocentric, anthrocentric species, we love to compare anything to us. In this particular case, it's the Taj Mahal, created by the Shah, Mughal Shah that was in power here, and his wife died, so he created a monument. Hence the scale is huge, monumental, to commemorate the loss of his dear wife. It's also quite stunning and beautiful on top of that. The scale can be altered by an artist in more subtle ways, and the next two examples, this one included, will show how various artists have manipulated the scale of the two central figures to the Pietà. Pietà is a familiar Renaissance icon, a situation that shows the Virgin Mary in Christianity with the deceased Jesus on her lap. This particular example is Perugino, a famous late Renaissance Italian painter. And Perugino has chosen to make the Jesus figure really pretty massive. I mean, he would be crushing Mary's legs here if he was sitting on her like that. So there are two different cults that exist, well, there are more than that, within Christianity. And one is more of a cult of Jesus, but there is also a strong cult of Mary. And in this particular example, we're seeing the Jesus figure being made oversized, the scale being increased in order to place more emphasis on Jesus. In contrast, Michelangelo tackled the same subject matter, as did many Renaissance artists, and this was about the same period as the Perugino. But you see here Michelangelo working in marble, it's an altogether different way of representing the same scene. The figure of Jesus is diminutive. He is really kind of sinking into the massive folds that make up Mary's garment. And Mary, because of her position, is dominant here. She's really the focus, whereas Jesus, yes, he's there, but he's not quite as prominent as Mary is. Different ways of looking at the same subject matter, altering scale in order to make a suggestion of emphasis one way or the other. Hierarchical scale, in this case Della Francesca, about 40 or 50 years before Michelangelo. And in this altarpiece painting, we've got the Madonna of Mercy shown really, really large in size compared to all the worshipers below. Well, it's not a literal picture here. It's intended to create a symbolic scale shift and size in the Madonna in order to indicate her importance and at the same time indicate that the worshippers below are subservient or inferior to the Madonna. This is an even more extreme example by famous Dutch painter Jan van Eyck, depicting the Madonna carrying the baby Jesus inside of a high Gothic cathedral. I don't know which one. Nonetheless, most people then, and we know, that a high Gothic cathedral probably had vaulting that was as much as 90 or 100 feet tall, some in northern France even taller than that, Amiens and Beauvais. So the suggestion here isn't that Mary is actually about 60 feet tall. I mean, the top of her crown is coming up to the bottom of the clerestory windows. It is a metaphorical piece that if the church itself structure is the body of the religion, that the Madonna exists within it as a really important figure. She cuts a wide swath within the church, metaphorically, not literally. An actual red poppy is about maybe 3 inches, maybe 4 inches in diameter. But here in Georgia O'Keeffe's red poppy, she's scaled it up. This canvas is about 40 by 30 inches. So the flower that you see here is something on the order of about 10 times larger than an actual red poppy. The point is to sort of force the viewer into a microscopic view, except that we haven't looked with a lens into our subject matter. It's as if the subject matter has shrunk the viewer. In any event, it causes you to look at a flower with a different kind of intensity. Of course, the flower is somewhat abstracted, but it makes you confront something, a flower, that you might normally just sort of dismiss as small and ordinary. It makes it more monumental. Who says that art doesn't have a sense of humor? Here again is our French trickster, René Magritte. Remember, in this piece, the point to it is that you don't know whether or not the objects are regular size in a miniature room, or whether the room is normal sized and the objects are huge. This is the point to Magritte's painting, is it is one or another, or maybe even both scale shifts, depending on the incongruence between the size of the objects. And it's impossible for you to reconcile what's been done here. What's real? You don't know what's real. That's the point. Scale shifts accomplish that goal in Magritte's painting. This is a really fun piece. It's in Los Angeles. Typically, you can go see it at the Broad Museum on Grand Avenue next to the Disney Concert Hall. Well, not right now, but anyway, hopefully soon. So it essentially is a scale shift. I think it's pretty obvious what's happening here. And Terrian is asking you to do a couple of things. One is to contemplate what your relationship with these objects is under normal circumstances. When suddenly they're blown up to a huge scale, look at the size of that table and chairs. It creates a different relationship. You have to look at it in a different way. Also, it is somewhat reminiscent of maybe when you were a little kid and you could actually walk underneath a table like that, even as a baby. So there's a humorous retro element as well, a regression to childhood that's built into the scale shift. Pretty good stuff. Earlier, we had a little bit of a forced perspective example with our farmer and the giant ears of corn that weren't actually giant. It's the way the picture was constructed. Here in this photo, I don't know if it's art. Well, the photographer is kind of sort of asking us to believe that the rainbow is emanating from this guy's mouth. And I don't know, this is what happens when you go out to the desert and the weather turns sour and probably had too many Coors Lights and all that sort of thing. Nonetheless, it's a pretty great picture, and it is basically an optical illusion. Size, scale, and symbolism. There's a lot to discuss here. Let's talk about the painter, Friedrich, as a romantic artist, meaning he existed in the Romantic period, which was the late 18th century, early 19th century. American Revolution had already taken place, the French Revolution, 1793. It was the time of Beethoven, of Schubert, and the Romantic period marks the emergence or the graduation of individual people away from just being subjects of a king, of being vassals. No, now it's starting to be considered that they can have thoughts, feelings, autonomy, even a vote. So Friedrich's piece here, Monk by the Sea, is an interesting depiction that's primarily a landscape. It's a bit of a dark and foreboding landscape too, with dark clouds, a dark sea, potentially kind of stormy. And then there's the little monk, which is just standing there like an ant in front of all this. This is a romantic expression of the concept of the sublime. It essentially has to do with the fact that a human is minuscule, apparently insignificant in the face of the grandeur of nature, the massiveness of it all. But at the same time, the human is a part of the larger whole too, and an integral and important part. That's the sort of duality that was an important aspect of the Romantic period, and that's why this painting and Friedrich as a painter are considered so important, because of the symbolic content of the work within the Romantic period. And it's all based upon scale. This is really a variation of the previous piece by Friedrich. It's a little bit less dark, but interesting because here we have an individual who's just perched on the side of this valley looking down towards the sea coast. It's quite beautiful, green, and the individual is contemplating beauty, and his thoughts are valid. His reaction to the environment is not something that is nonsensical or meaningless, but no, it actually has value for him as an individual. That's an important distinction between the way people existed primarily before this time. Talking about proportions, again, is a relative exercise. We're talking about the size of things compared to other things within perhaps the same picture plane, and whether or not we consider those proportions to be normal as we expect to see them in actual reality, or perhaps they've been distorted. In the case of Botero, a distortion was his tool of the trade, and let's look at the central figure. First of all, the relationship of the eyes to the nose, mustache, and then to the lips. The proportions, the size of these objects, and where they're located within this part of the face is normal proportions, very realistic. However, when we get to the ear, well, because of the size of the face here, we expect the ear to be right here, but it's another 25% to the right. When we go from the lips, we expect the chin to be right about here. But no, it's way down here, another 25%. So Botero has distorted the normal proportions of the human head in order to make aspects of it larger than you would expect to see. Polykleitos was a Greek sculptor, artist, philosopher, mathematician, and he created about 2,005 years ago what became to be the textbook, let's say, for beauty and ideal proportions of the human figure. And it wasn't just simply to enjoy the human figure, but it was also to understand that nature gave us a standard, an ideal for beauty, and it was being expressed through the human figure. It's important to note that this included aspects of the pose rather than just measurements, let's say, of the subject matter, himself or herself. And these are concepts of tension and relaxation. This particular sculpture is a marble copy of the original. I believe the original was in metal, perhaps bronze. The Romans, 500 years later and more, had basically copied or adopted what Polykleitos had established in the Greek era, and it continued on even later, as we'll see in a moment. This is the work of Michelangelo. It's the Renaissance. It's 2,000 years after Polykleitos, and 500 years ago to us. It's illustrative of the Italian term contrapposto, which means counterpose. And here we have the figure of David. Let's talk about these elements here. Tension versus relaxation. We see it in this leg supporting the weight. That's tension. This leg is unweighted or relaxed. This arm is bent up to the shoulder in a position of tension. This arm is hanging loose, relaxation. By extension, the same occurs with the ideas of weight and lightness. The weight is placed here on this leg. This leg is light, could even drift up a wee bit, let's say. And finally, direction and gesture. In contrapposto, the beauty of the form was considered by not having it just posed dead on, standing straight up like some kind of a schematic drawing, but by the twist of the various axes of the body. So you see the hips are tilted like this, higher on the left to the right, and then the spine is turned, the shoulders are tilted the opposite way. And the hips face forward, the shoulders face slightly different, and the head is turned away again. So these twisting parts of the body were considered the ideal representation of the proportions of the human figure. It goes on from there. There's much more to it, but we'll stop. This is the beautiful spiral form of the chambered nautilus. The Greeks were aware of this form, and the Greeks knew about other spirals that existed in nature and determined that the spiral was, well, one of the most important forms that existed in the natural world. And they used it as the basis for mathematical attempts to quantify what beauty could be. And what does that mean? Well, it means the golden mean. The golden mean can take a second before you get it figured out, but essentially it means that the ratio of A plus B, this distance here, when compared to just A alone, this is 1.618 compared to this. Now, if we turn our attention to A representing the big side, the representation of A is larger than B by the same ratio, 1.618. Here's the spiral again, our chambered nautilus. Let's look at how the golden mean applies. So the longest side of the entire, this measurement of the entire form, is this side right here. This side is 1.618 times larger than this side right here, which is the measurement from here to here. And then it goes down from there. Here's the next block. This point right here, 1.618 to this side here. And then it goes down to this block, 1.618 to 1 here. And then to this block, long side, short side. And then to this block. long side, short side. And it can be reduced ad infinitum. It can also be increased forever too, as much space as you possibly have. Here's an expression of the golden mean, the golden rectangle, perhaps easier to digest because, well, this is how you build websites. This is a slightly loose interpretation of the golden mean and the spiral used in a pictorial composition, digital art, starting from a central focal point, here the window illuminated from inside, and then the spiral based upon the proportions of 1 to 1.618 ticks off various intersections, the edge of the picture plane, and now through this semicircular, what should we call it, foliage through the foreground and off the picture plane, forming the basis for the composition, which mimics the shape of the chambered nautilus using the golden mean quite effectively. Robert Smithson was a land artist. He died tragically too young, but this is his most famous work, the Spiral Jetty, which emanates off the edge of the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and you can go there. And it's not a functional sculpture because, well, as jetties go, it just really wouldn't work that well. But as a piece of art, it was a more modern expression of this Greek idea that the spiral, a natural form, was something that was inherently pleasing aesthetically. And Smithson took it to the nth degree by building this jetty, which still exists. There you have it. Fibonacci numbers are another expression that derive from the golden rectangle or the golden mean, because the ratio of 1 to 1.618 is roughly a ratio of 5 to 8. And we see expressed in Fibonacci numbers that relationship of 5, then to 8, then 8 to 13, 13 to 21, which roughly maintains that ratio as you go up in the sequence. Well, we don't need to go too deeply into it, except that even here, much later, 1979, an artist like Jack Tworkov, who was conscious of Fibonacci numbers, was using it as a means of constructing a composition, producing artwork. And that's it.